So in a welfare assessment, you're collecting quite a lot of different measures of indicators. And when you do this, you often need to aggregate these measures into one common value. And that is what I'm going to talk about today. I'll also briefly mention something about certification assessment, give a couple of examples, and briefly touch on the problems and possibilities there are for aggregation systems. So I would like you to have a look at this. This is a very, very simple version where we have 8 different measures and we have 2 different farms. This is a survey we sent out to researchers, asking them to evaluate this, saying, all right, so which one of these farms has the best welfare? Now, I know that this is broiler data, not pig data, but I mean, exactly the same holds true for pigs. And if you take a moment to look at it, you can see that it's quite difficult, isn't it? I mean, you have pork burns being more severe in situation A than situation B. You have slaughterhouse rejections being less in A than B. Foodborne dermatitis is worse in B than A. Dead on arrival, dislocations, fractures, etc. And of course, what you come up with will depend on your evaluation of how bad is each of these different values for each of these farms. But putting them together is really, really tough. Now, a diagram like this, which contains only a couple of indicators, is difficult to do. And it's certainly not something you would like a consumer to try to do. Not least because the consumer normally doesn't know a lot about the individual measures. What the consumer simply wants to know is, all right, is this a good farm or a bad farm? Possibly, is this an excellent farm or good farm or bad farm? Consider the welfare quality protocol, which I talked about last time. In the welfare quality protocol, there are more than 30 measures. I mean, there are so many measures that would be hard to keep them all on the same package. So for consumers, this fine-grained responses isn't very interesting. And in actual fact, it's not very interesting for the competent authorities either. The only ones really interested in this fine-grained resolution are the farmers. The farmers need it because the farmers need to know exactly what is it that is wrong with my farm. Where should I try to improve? So of course they're interested in the whole picture, so to speak. But everyone else is really only interested in some kind of aggregated response. Now, when we're talking about aggregation, I think it's important to talk about certification and assessment and the differences and similarities there are. So legislation and certification are different from assessment. Just like welfare control is different from welfare assessment. So legislation is about welfare control. And in most cases, not all, but in almost all cases, certification is also about control rather than assessment. So what's the difference? Well, in certification and legislation, what you do is that you set a minimum standard. So the minimum standard is typically based on resource-based measures. If you remember, we talked about resource-based measures, management-based measures, and animal-based measures last time. And the reason for why legislation and certification chooses to use resource-based measures is that they give a degree of predictability for the farmer. So if you come to a farm and you say, all right, you can have a maximum of 18 pigs per pen, the farmer can have counted it and said, all right, yes, there are 18 pigs. 1, 2, 3, 4. No problem. Or you say a pen should be at least 5 square meters. No problem. Take out your measuring tape and 5 square meters. The farmer knows what the rules are and he knows whether he's complying with it or not. When you're using animal-based measures, there's a problem. Because, of course, you could say, all right, you have tail biting here. Because you have tail biting, we'll fine you. But the farmer can say, all right, yes, I have tail biting, but I've done everything I can. There's nothing more I can do to prevent tail biting. It just happened. Or even, there was no tail biting this morning, there's tail biting now. So for the farmer, there's very little predictability when you're using animal-based measures. So that's a weakness of animal-based measures. In legislation and certification, what you do is that you typically set a minimum standard. So you're saying no animal or no farm should be below this standard. In assessment, you can say, well, it may be that you're complying with the legislation, but what we're looking for is an even better farm. Or you are complying with the certification scheme, and we want you to be even better. And you have the possibility of having a value that is higher than the minimum standard. So in legislation, you typically have no aggregation at all. Just you are complying with legislation or you're not complying with the legislation. So here are a couple of animal welfare certification schemes. Freedom Food, RSPCA monitored, is perhaps one of the best known. Better Leven from the Netherlands. I would argue that it is perhaps one of the most successful animal welfare certification schemes. To the extent that nowadays all animal products sold in the Netherlands actually carry the label Better Leven. This is not legislation. It's something that the big retailers have agreed on, which is quite impressive to my mind. Here in Denmark, a couple of years ago, Bedre Dyrevelfærd was introduced, better animal welfare, with 3 hearts, just like Better Leven has 3 stars, with ever-increasing requirements. So these are, of course, requirements over and above the legislative demands. When you're doing animal welfare assessment and when you're doing aggregation, one important question is this. So what is important? To say that we have 2 situations. In the first one, in the first one, all pigs are tail-docked. And in that farm, when that happens, there's only one pig that is being tail bitten. In the second farm, no pig is tail locked, but 2 pigs are tail bitten. So now the question becomes, all right, so which farm has the best welfare? And this depends on your approach to animal welfare. One possibility is saying, well, we'll take the average of all the welfare of all pigs, in which case farm 2 is probably going to be the most welfare-friendly farm. An alternative is saying, no, what we should be doing is to protect the worst of individuals, just like in legislation. So we should put more emphasis on the ones that have a really bad welfare. So in that case, the first farm is the one that has the best welfare. And this is not just a theoretical, philosophical discussion. This really influences actually both legislation and the way you want to aggregate animal welfare scores. So the 2 approaches are incompatible. You have to choose one or the other. Take the average of the suffering or protect the worst of animals. Now I'm saying take the average of the suffering. That's not really true. I mean, because what you're doing is not, one possibility is taking the average. I'll get back to that. But there are other ways of aggregating as well. So when you're doing a welfare assessment, typically what you do is, the first step is saying, all right, so I have a number of indicators, a number of measures. So if I have these measures, what is the welfare consequence of it? And one issue is, of course, that you can't really, there's no common coin, so to speak, for what is the suffering of a hernia, in this case, or a shoulder wound, or a bitten tail. You have to rely on expert evaluation. That is what everyone is doing. So you send out surveys like this. Unfortunately, in many cases, you have very many different indicators, and each indicator has different states. So you have a small hernia, a larger hernia, or an even larger hernia. And you need to get an answer for each of these, which means that for the poor respondent to your survey, it's often a very long survey and takes a lot of time to fill it. Once you've done that, you often encounter a second step. And that step is similar to the first one that I showed you, which in this case is very simple. All right, so you have one farm with 30% hungry pigs, and 30% hungry pigs and 40% thirsty pigs. What's their welfare? And then you have another farm with 40% thirsty pigs and 30% hungry pigs. What's their welfare? Now, the value you're going to give will depend on how you have assessed hunger and thirst, how bad it is to be hungry or thirsty, according to the definitions you're given. But you could also imagine that saying, hey, say that thirst is worse than hunger. Then I'm going to say the value for the combination of hunger and thirst is not only the proportion hungry and thirsty, but I added another value. I added the extra value because some pigs are going to be both hungry and thirsty. So you have a combination of stressors. And of course, this makes it incredibly complicated, try to derive any sensible information from it. But that's unfortunately real life. The alternative is going back to this and trying to get people to answer something like this. Which we have done in the aWISH project. But everyone I've spoken to has had problems with it. Everyone. Because it is very, very difficult. This is just one example. Imagine having 30, 40 of these and trying to assess them in different combinations. Yeah. All right, so one, if you're looking at this, I hope you can see. Are you seeing the bottom here? Can you read what it says?
Yes, we can see it.
Good. Okay, so this is percentage of lean pigs in the farm. And this is the score experts have given a given farm. So it's just one parameter, just one indicator. And if you look at the curve, you can say, all right, so if you have, say, 10% lean pigs, that's, well, a 50% reduction in your welfare. If you have 20% lean pigs, twice as many, that means that you have only 70% reduction of your welfare. So the more lean pigs you have, the less is the importance of each additional pig. When you ask experts, this type of curve is almost always the one you get. This example is fetched from the welfare quality report on pig welfare, the protocol for assessing pig welfare. But it's the same when it comes to tail biting or shoulder wounds, what have you. And in some sense, this is, to my mind, counterintuitive. Because this means that the value of suffering for an individual pig depends on how many other lean pigs there are, which doesn't really seem all that logical. So an alternative to doing that is to take the average, and that is what we're doing in the aWISH project. Now, this approach is quite transparent. I mean, you just take the average welfare of all individuals. It has the advantage that it gives the same weight to all animals. And since it's transparent, it's very easy to explain for persons from without the project. It's very easy to explain to consumers. It's easy to explain to the competent authorities. But there is one problem. And the problem is one of compensation. So if you look at the examples here, because this goes back to what I said before. If you look at the example, now, this is just for one indicator, tail docking and tail biting. Let's say that take something else. Let's say that you have a lot of straw in your pens. So you get a very high welfare score for straw. Is that then okay to have lots of tail biting going on? Well, if you just take the average, the effect of the straw is going to reduce the effect of the tail biting, which may seem not very good. Because of course you don't want tail biting. You want tail biting to be punished. And likewise, I mean, you could imagine a farm with, say, 5 sections. In 4 of the sections, you have a lot of straw. In the 5th, you don't have any straw. All right, so is the average okay? This would correspond to the example here with the tail biting, tail locking. So, although taking the average is, I think, a good and reasonable way forward, it is by no means uncontroversial. And the compensation part is something which often causes problems or issues. Yes, so I talked about compensation.